Hot lacquer paint stung the nostrils of flight deck crews as aircraft engines coughed to life in the pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942. This is the story of how Japan's most elite naval strike force sailed into what they believed would be their greatest victory, only to discover that their enemy had been reading their mail for months. In the space of 5 minutes, an empire's naval dominance would crumble into the Pacific depths, changing the course of World War II and sealing the fate of millions across the Pacific. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching his flight crews prepare for what naval doctrine promised would be another crushing blow against American forces. The salt spray from the ship's bow wave caught the morning light as his 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, cut through swells toward their target, the tiny American outpost of Midway Atoll. The Kido Butai, Japan's elite carrier striking force, had spent 6 months writing their legend across the Pacific. Pearl Harbor had been their masterpiece of surprise. Darwin, Australia, had burned under their bombs. British carriers had fled the Indian Ocean after tasting their steel. Now, Operation MI would complete the circle of Japanese dominance by drawing the remaining American carriers into a trap and destroying them forever. Below decks, armorers and ordnance handlers worked in the humid darkness of hangar bays, wrestling 250-kilogram land bombs and Type 91 torpedoes into position. Sweat mixed with cordite dust on their khaki sleeves as they prepared the morning strike package. The institutional confidence was palpable these same crews had armed the planes that had shattered Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. At 4:30 a.m., Nagumo launched his first wave toward Midway, 108 aircraft screaming off 4 flight decks in the coordinated ballet that had become Japanese naval aviation's signature. 36 D-3A dive bombers, 36 B-5N attack planes loaded with land bombs, and 36 A-6M0 escorts climbed into the darkness, their navigation lights soon swallowed by distance. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga led the strike from his position in a Hiryu bomber, unaware that American codebreakers had been reading Japanese naval communications for weeks. The surprise that Japanese planners counted on had already evaporated in the radio intercept rooms of Pearl Harbor, where analysts had pieced together enough fragments of the JN-25 naval code to position 3 American aircraft carriers northeast of Midway. What the Japanese flight crews couldn't know as they droned toward their target was that Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's Task Force 17 was already stalking them, guided by intelligence intercepts that had transformed their carefully planned ambush into a potential death trap. On the carrier flight decks, plane handlers smelled the familiar cocktail of hot avgas and engine oil as they spotted the reserve aircraft. The morning air carried the metallic taste of sea spray mixed with exhaust fumes as Combat Air Patrol Zeros roared overhead, their pilots scanning empty horizons for threats that Doctrine insisted couldn't possibly be there. But Doctrine, as the Japanese were about to discover, had never faced an enemy who could read their battle plans before they were issued. The morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific, casting long shadows across flight decks where crews worked with the casual efficiency of veterans. Rice balls and miso soup had been consumed in mess halls hours earlier, followed by the brief ritual of bowing to photographs of the Emperor. Now came the waiting, the eternal rhythm of naval warfare where hours of preparation compressed into minutes of violence. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and mastermind of Operation MI, remained hundreds of miles behind his striking force with the main body of the combined fleet. Radio silence protocols kept him isolated from the developing battle, a decision that would prove fatally flawed as events spiraled beyond any single commander's ability to control. On picket destroyers surrounding the carriers, lookouts strained against wind blasts through their binoculars, searching for the enemy submarines that Japanese intelligence insisted were prowling these waters. The smell of cordite from recent anti-aircraft drills mixed with sea salt as gunners checked their 25mm mounts and Type 89 dual-purpose guns. Yet even as the Kido Butai steamed toward what its commanders believed would be another decisive victory, the seeds of catastrophe were already sprouting in the decision-making processes that had brought them to this point. The same tactical doctrines that had delivered stunning victories at Pearl Harbor and across the Pacific were about to encounter an enemy that had adapted, learned, and prepared. Can you imagine standing on those flight decks, breathing that mixture of aviation fuel and ocean spray, confident in your superiority while sailing toward an enemy who already knew you were coming? If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal naval battles, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from the Japanese perspective. I'm recording this from my studio here in California at 11:15 p.m., and your support helps me bring these forgotten voices back to life. As Tomonaga's strike package disappeared into the morning haze, heading for what they believed would be an unsuspecting American garrison, the first domino in a catastrophic chain reaction was already beginning to fall, but the crew of the cruiser Tone had no idea that their faulty catapult would help decide the fate of empires. Section 2. The Fatal Delay. A metal catapult arm groaned under stress as maintenance crews struggled with the Tone's stubborn No. 4 float plane, hydraulic fluid mixing with morning dew on the cruiser's deck plates. The fate of the Kido Butai now hung on 30 minutes of mechanical failure that would cascade into strategic catastrophe. While Japanese doctrine demanded precise scouting coverage to protect the striking force, the gods of war were already tilting the scales against Nagumo's meticulously planned operation. At 7:28 a.m., nearly half an hour behind schedule, Tone's No. 4 scout finally clawed into the sky, its pilot unaware that his delayed launch would become one of history's most consequential mechanical failures. The float plane banked eastward on its search pattern, covering the very sector where American Task Forces 16 and 17 lay hidden beyond the horizon. Meanwhile, Tomonaga's strike force had reached Midway, diving through scattered clouds to pummel the American garrison. The thunder of bombs echoed across the tiny atoll as hangars erupted in orange fireballs and runways cracked under the assault. Sand and coral grit embedded itself in aircraft tires during the attack, grinding like pumice against aluminum as the Japanese planes prepared to return home. But even as his bombers savaged the island's defenses, Tomonaga's experienced eye caught troubling details. American fighters were still taking off despite the bombardment. Anti-aircraft guns continued firing from concealed positions. The island's ability to launch attacks remained dangerously intact. His radio crackled to life. Second attack necessary to neutralize remaining defenses. The message that would seal the Kido Butai's fate had been transmitted. Back on the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo received Tomonaga's assessment with growing unease. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized overwhelming first strikes that eliminated enemy resistance completely. A second attack meant his carefully orchestrated timeline was already fracturing. Below decks, ordnance crews had been working since dawn to rearm the reserve aircraft. The smell of gasoline and solvent filled the hangar bays, as armored bombs and torpedoes were wrestled into position. Handlers wiped sweat from their faces, leaving dark smears on khaki uniforms as they prepared for what should have been a routine follow-up strike. Then came the radio message that shattered all assumptions. 10 enemy ships bearing 10 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway reported the delayed scout from Tone No. 4. The transmission hit the Akagi's radio room like a physical blow, operators staring at their equipment in disbelief before rushing the message to the bridge. Nagumo's staff officers crowded around the communication, their faces reflecting the sudden realization that their perfect plan had just collided with an unwelcome reality. Enemy ships, but what kind? Destroyers? Cruisers? Or the American carriers that intelligence had insisted were still thousands of miles away in Pearl Harbor? The Admiral's dilemma crystallized in that moment of mechanical silence, broken only by the hum of ventilation fans and the distant throb of engines. His reserve aircraft were currently being armed with land bombs for the second Midway strike. If those ships included American carriers, every minute spent with the wrong ordnance meant potential disaster. Rearm with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, Nagumo ordered, his voice carrying the weight of split-second decision-making under impossible pressure. Prepare for naval engagement. The command rippled through the task force like electricity. In hangars across 4 carriers, ordnance crews received the soul-crushing news that hours of preparation had just become meaningless. 250-kilogram land bombs had to be removed, stored, and replaced with anti-ship weapons, a process that would consume precious time while American forces of unknown strength closed the distance. Chief Petty Officer Abe Zenji, working in Kaga's forward hangar, felt his stomach drop as the new orders reached his section. Around him, exhausted handlers began the back-breaking work of switching ordnance loads while aviation gasoline fumes made their heads swim. The deck cycle that had been Japan's signature tactical advantage was now working against them. But even as crews scrambled to rearm, another crisis demanded attention. Tomonaga's returning strike force was approaching the task force with fuel gauges showing dangerously low levels. Japanese carrier doctrine demanded that returning aircraft take priority pilots couldn't be left to ditch in the ocean while ordnance was being switched below. The flight decks had to be cleared for recovery operations, forcing the newly armed aircraft back down to the hangars. In the confined spaces below, Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs sat stacked alongside aviation fuel lines and electrical systems, a combination that would prove catastrophically volatile once American bombs began falling. As morning wore into late morning, combat air patrol Zeros scrambled repeatedly to intercept American aircraft launching from Midway. The defenders were coming in waves, lumbering B-26 Marauders skimming the wavetops, high-flying B-17 flying fortresses, dropping sticks of bombs from 20,000 feet, and marine dive bombers pressing attacks with suicidal determination. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, leading a section of Zeros from Kaga, tasted cordite and metal in his mouth as he pressed another attack against a formation of American torpedo planes. His machine guns chattered, tracers stitching through enemy wings, but for every plane that fell, smoking into the sea, more kept coming. The constant combat was wearing down his pilots and burning precious fuel. Each scramble meant another recovery, another takeoff, another drain on resources that were supposed to be concentrated into a single overwhelming strike. The Americans weren't winning these individual engagements, but they were accomplishing something more valuable. They were destroying the Kido Butai's tactical tempo. What none of the Japanese commanders yet understood was that their perfectly choreographed battle plan was unraveling not because of American strength, but because of American intelligence. The enemy knew they were coming, knew their approximate positions, and was already vectoring 3 carrier task forces toward an intercept. High above the Japanese formation, a lone PBY Catalina flying boat circled just beyond anti-aircraft range. Its crew radioing position reports back to Pearl Harbor. The enemy ships that Tone's scout had reported weren't running away, they were racing toward a confrontation that would decide the war in the Pacific. Imagine yourself in that cramped PBY cockpit, watching the most powerful naval striking force in history steaming below, knowing that your country's survival might depend on the messages you're transmitting into an empty sky. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across flight decks where crews worked with increasing desperation to rearm aircraft for a battle they didn't yet know they were already losing. Section 3. The Hunters Become Hunted. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey banked his SBD Dauntless through scattered clouds at 14,000 feet, the Pacific spreading endlessly below like hammered steel under the climbing sun. The American dive bombers had been airborne for hours, burning precious fuel while searching for a Japanese fleet that seemed to have vanished into the morning haze. What McCluskey couldn't know was that his frustrating search pattern was about to intersect with the most catastrophic 5 minutes in Japanese naval history. Far below, the destroyer Arashi raced across the swells at flank speed, her bow wave cutting a white scar through blue water. She had just finished depth charging the American submarine Nautilus, driving the underwater intruder away from the Japanese formation with patterns of explosives that sent towering geysers into the sky. But in her haste to rejoin the main body, Arashi was unknowingly serving as a pointer, her high-speed wake stretching like an arrow across the ocean's surface, directly toward the position where Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers were steaming in formation. The destroyer's captain had no idea that his navigation choice would guide American dive bombers to their target. Aboard the flagship Akagi, the morning had dissolved into a nightmare of cascading decisions. Nagumo's staff watched their tactical timeline fragment as competing demands tore at the fabric of Japanese carrier doctrine. Tomonaga's aircraft had been recovered, their fuel tanks nearly empty and their pilots exhausted from the Midway strike. Now they needed immediate rearming and refueling before they could launch again. Meanwhile, the reserve strike force remained trapped in a deadly dance of ordnance handling. Bombs that had been removed were now being reinstalled. Torpedoes were being wheeled back into position. In the sweltering hangar bays, ordnance crews worked amid the sharp smell of aviation, gasoline, and the metallic taste of sweat mixed with cordite dust. Chief Aviation Ordnanceman Matsuda felt the deck plates vibrate under his feet as Akagi maneuvered into the wind for another aircraft recovery. Around him, handlers struggled with the weight of armor-piercing bombs, while fuel lines snaked across the deck like black serpents. The confined hangar space reeked of gasoline fumes and hot metal, a combination that made experienced sailors nervous even under normal circumstances. But normal had ceased to exist the moment American aircraft began appearing on the horizon in seemingly endless waves. Zero fighters from the Combat Air Patrol dove repeatedly to intercept formations of American torpedo planes, their 20mm cannons ripping through wings and fuselages with deadly precision. The slow, obsolete devastators fell like autumn leaves, spiraling into the Pacific with crews still trapped inside their shattered cockpits. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai vectoring his Zero toward another group of approaching torpedo bombers, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as enemy aircraft filled his gun sight. The Americans were flying straight and level, making textbook attack runs that should have been suicide against experienced Japanese pilots. His machine guns chattered, tracers reaching out to touch another devastator that immediately began trailing smoke. What Sakai couldn't understand was why they kept coming. American doctrine seemed to demand these futile attacks, sending squadron after squadron to their deaths in the face of overwhelming Japanese air superiority. It was magnificent in its futility and strategically brilliant in ways that wouldn't become clear for another few minutes. The torpedo attacks were accomplishing exactly what American planners had hoped. Every Zero that dove to attack the low-flying devastators was a Zero that wasn't climbing to intercept the high-altitude dive bombers approaching from multiple directions. The combat air patrol was being systematically dragged down to sea level, leaving the upper altitudes virtually undefended. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, still searching for the Japanese fleet with fuel gauges showing dangerously low levels, finally spotted the white wake of Arashi stretching across the ocean below. Following that accidental navigation aid, he adjusted course and climbed toward what he hoped would be his target. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey's radio crackled with the transmission that would echo through naval history. Enemy carriers in sight. Below his formation, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steamed in perfect tactical formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. But perfect formations make perfect targets. From 18,000 feet, the Dauntlesses began their dives, wing-mounted dive brakes screaming as they plunged toward targets that had no idea death was falling from above. In the cramped cockpits, pilots felt the familiar sensation of blood draining from their heads as G-forces built during the near-vertical descent. Aboard Kaga, Lieutenant Commander Takehiko Chihaya was supervising aircraft refueling operations when someone shouted a warning from the island superstructure. He looked up to see black specks growing larger against the blue sky, diving with the terrible inevitability of birds of prey. The first bomb struck Kaga's flight deck near the island, punching through steel plates and exploding in the hangar bay below. Aviation gasoline erupted in a sheet of flame that raced along fuel lines and engulfed parked aircraft. The explosion's overpressure shattered light bulbs throughout the ship, plunging compartments into darkness filled with the screams of burning men. Akagi took her fatal blow moments later, a single 1,000-pound bomb landing near the midships elevator and detonating among aircraft armed with bombs and torpedoes. The secondary explosions that followed turned the flagship's hangar deck into a blast furnace, steel bulkheads glowing cherry red as aviation fuel fed flames that reached temperatures hot enough to melt aluminum. Soryu died third, multiple bomb hits igniting her flight deck and turning her into a floating crematorium. Witnesses later recalled that the carrier's deck plates glowed like the inside of a kiln, heat so intense that paint bubbled and peeled from surfaces hundreds of feet away. Black smoke boiled upward under a sky that had been clear just minutes before. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers that had brought death to Pearl Harbor were transformed from instruments of war into funeral pyres. The Kido Butai's era of dominance died in that brief span of time, consumed by flames that could be seen for miles across the Pacific. Imagine standing on one of those burning flight decks, feeling the heat against your face while knowing that the naval war you thought you were winning had just been lost in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. But one Japanese carrier remained undamaged, and Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi was already planning his counterstrike against the American forces that had just delivered this devastating blow. Section 4. The Last Samurai's Strike. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of Hiryu, watching 3 pillars of black smoke rise from his sister carriers as flames consumed what had been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy just minutes before. The youngest flag officer in the Japanese fleet, Yamaguchi commanded Carrier Division 2 with the aggressive instincts that had made him a rising star in naval aviation circles. While other admirals might have retreated to preserve their remaining strength, Yamaguchi saw only one honorable course: immediate and overwhelming retaliation against the American carriers that had delivered this devastating blow. Hiryu remained untouched by the American dive bomber attack, her flight deck clear and her aircraft armed for battle. The carrier's crew could taste the acrid smoke drifting from their burning companions on the morning breeze, a constant reminder that they were now the sole surviving instrument of Japanese carrier aviation at Midway. Lieutenant Commander Michio Kobayashi, leading Hiryu's dive bomber squadron, felt sweat beading inside his leather flying helmet as he climbed into his D-3A Val. Around him, Ordnance crews made final checks on the 250-kilogram armor-piercing bombs slung beneath his aircraft. The smell of aviation gasoline mixed with cordite from recent anti-aircraft fire, creating the familiar cocktail of odors that defined naval aviation combat. At 12:20 p.m., 18 Vals roared off Hiryu's flight deck, their engines straining under the weight of bombs and the emotional burden of vengeance. Escorted by 6 Zero fighters, they climbed into the afternoon sky with a singular purpose: find the American carriers and make them pay for the morning's destruction. The Japanese pilots didn't have to search long. Intelligence reports and scouting aircraft had identified the approximate position of Task Force 17, built around the carrier USS Yorktown. What the Japanese aviators couldn't know was that damage control parties aboard their target had already repaired much of the harm inflicted during the Coral Sea battle just 1 month earlier. As Kobayashi's formation approached the American task force, anti-aircraft fire began bursting around their aircraft like deadly black flowers. Shell fragments rattled against aluminum fuselages, while tracers streaked past cockpit canopies, the familiar taste of adrenaline and metal-filled pilots' mouths as they pressed their attack through the defensive barrage. The Vals peeled off into their dives at 12:45 p.m., wing-mounted air brakes screaming as they plunged toward Yorktown's flight deck from 12,000 feet. American fighters rose to meet them, but the Japanese formation had achieved surprise and tactical positioning that allowed most of the bombers to complete their attacks. 3 bombs struck Yorktown in rapid succession, punching through her flight deck and exploding deep in the ship's vitals. The carrier's boiler uptakes were severed, cutting steam to her engines and leaving her dead in the water as black smoke poured from ruptured ventilation systems. For a moment, it appeared that Yamaguchi's counterstrike had achieved the kind of decisive result that Japanese doctrine demanded. But American damage control proved more effective than Japanese intelligence had anticipated. Within an hour, Yorktown's engineering crews had restored steam to her boilers, patched critical systems, and returned the carrier to operational status. The ship that Japanese pilots reported as sinking was soon launching aircraft again. Yamaguchi wasn't finished. At 2:30 p.m., he launched Hiryu's second strike, 10 B-5N Kate torpedo bombers escorted by 6 Zeros, led by Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto. The formation carried the most dangerous anti-ship weapons in the Japanese arsenal, aerial torpedoes that could punch holes below any warship's waterline and send her to the bottom. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tominaga, hero of the morning's Midway strike, insisted on leading this second attack despite flying an aircraft with fuel tanks damaged by American anti-aircraft fire. Gasoline seeped from patched bullet holes, leaving a visible trail in the air as his Kate struggled to maintain formation. His crew pleaded with him to transfer to another aircraft, but Tominaga refused to delay the mission while his comrades died on burning carriers behind him. The torpedo attack approached Yorktown from multiple angles, Japanese pilots pressing their runs despite a wall of anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky into a maze of explosions and tracers. The smell of cordite and burning oil filled cockpits as aircraft bucked through the defensive barrage, their crews gripping controls with hands slick from sweat and fear. 2 torpedoes found their mark, striking Yorktown below the waterline and flooding critical compartments. The carrier began listing to port as tons of seawater poured through ruptured hull plates. This time, the damage proved too severe for immediate repair. American sailors began abandoning ship as their vessel rolled slowly toward her final plunge into the Pacific depths. But even as Hiryu's aviators celebrated their success, American search planes were already vectoring toward their position. The Japanese carrier had revealed her location through radio transmissions during the strikes, and Enterprise's SBD Dauntlesses were racing toward an intercept, with fuel tanks topped off and bomb racks fully loaded. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Enterprise Air Group's dive-bombing squadron, could smell the smoke from burning Japanese carriers long before he spotted Hiryu steaming alone on the afternoon sea. The surviving Japanese carrier was attempting evasive maneuvers, her wake describing wide S-curves as her captain tried to avoid the bombs he knew were coming. At 5:10 p.m., Best's Dauntlesses began their dives on Hiryu, plunging through scattered anti-aircraft fire toward the last operational Japanese carrier at Midway. The familiar sensation of blood pooling in their legs returned as G-forces built during the near-vertical descent, but these pilots had been practicing their deadly trade all morning on stationary targets. 4 direct hits transformed Hiryu from a functioning aircraft carrier into a floating inferno within minutes. Aviation gasoline erupted in sheets of flame that raced through hangar spaces and up ventilation trunks, creating an updraft so powerful that debris was sucked into the sky like a reverse waterfall. The heat became so intense that steel bulkheads glowed red and aluminum fixtures melted into shapeless puddles. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi refused all entreaties to abandon his flagship, choosing instead to remain aboard the burning carrier as flames consumed the last vestige of Japanese naval aviation at Midway. Officers later recalled seeing him standing calmly on the bridge as paint bubbled on nearby bulkheads, a figure of stoic resignation amid the chaos of a dying warship. Think about that moment standing on a burning flight deck, knowing that your decision to seek vengeance had just sealed your own fate and ended your nation's hope of victory in the Pacific. As darkness fell over the battle zone, 4 aircraft carriers that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months were either sinking or burning out of control, their aircraft and irreplaceable aircrew lost forever to the depths of the Pacific Ocean. Section 5. The Night of Burning Ships. The destroyer Nagumo approached the burning hulk of Akagi through seas slicked with aviation gasoline, her searchlights cutting through smoke that reeked of melted aluminum and charred human flesh. Captain Taijiro Aoki had received the most painful orders of his naval career. Deliver the coup de grace to Japan's most famous aircraft carrier, the ship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and carried the Emperor's hopes across the Pacific for 6 months of unbroken victory. Now she drifted powerless and ablaze, her flight deck buckled from internal explosions and her hull glowing like a forge from fires burning deep in her vitals. Aboard Akagi, the surviving crew members worked with desperate efficiency to evacuate wounded shipmates and salvage what equipment they could before abandoning their dying flagship. The smell of burning aviation fuel mixed with the copper scent of blood as medical parties carried stretchers through compartments where emergency lighting cast hellish shadows on bulkheads streaked with soot. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and one of Japan's most brilliant carrier tacticians, stood on the flagship's bridge, watching flames consume the aircraft that should have been launching toward American targets. His carefully planned operation had disintegrated in minutes, victim of intelligence failures and tactical inflexibility that no amount of individual courage could overcome. The evacuation proceeded with the grim efficiency that characterized Japanese naval operations. Sailors formed human chains to pass wounded men up through smoke-filled passages, while damage control parties flooded magazines to prevent the massive secondary explosions that would soon claim their sister ships. The deck plates beneath their feet radiated heat like a stovetop, forcing them to move quickly between positions to avoid burns. Emperor Hirohito's portrait was removed from the ship's shrine with elaborate ceremony, wrapped in silk and transferred to a waiting destroyer with the reverence reserved for sacred relics. Even in defeat, certain protocols had to be observed. The Rising Sun naval ensign was struck and folded according to regulation, its red disc now destined for a museum rather than another victory. Similar scenes played out across the darkening Pacific as 3 other aircraft carriers entered their death throes. Kaga had suffered catastrophic magazine explosions that split her hull and sent towering fireballs into the evening sky. Sailors abandoning ship could hear ammunition cooking off in the inferno below, random explosions that sent shrapnel screaming through the superstructure like deadly hail. Soryu died more slowly, her crew fighting fires for hours before accepting that their ship was beyond salvation. Chief Petty Officer Abe remembered the taste of smoke and fear as he helped lower wounded men into life rafts, their burns wrapped in bandages that quickly became soaked with blood and seawater. The carrier's final plunge came near sunset, her bow lifting briefly toward the sky before she slid beneath the waves with a sound like thunder. But it was Hiryu's death that proved most dramatic. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi had chosen to remain aboard his burning flagship, standing calmly on the bridge as flames consumed the last Japanese carrier capable of launching aircraft. His staff officers pleaded with him to transfer to a destroyer, but the admiral remained unmoved by their arguments. "The responsibility is mine," Yamaguchi reportedly told his aide-de-camp. "I will not abandon the men who died following my orders." Whether these were his exact words remains debated by historians, but multiple witnesses recalled his absolute refusal to leave the burning carrier. Captain Tomiokaku, Hiryu's commanding officer, made the same choice. Both men were last seen standing together on the ship's bridge as flames reached the superstructure, 2 figures silhouetted against an inferno that had once been the most modern aircraft carrier in the world. The night sea became a constellation of tragedy. Survivors floated among debris fields that stretched for miles, clinging to life preservers and wreckage, while destroyers played searchlights across oil-slicked waters, hunting for the living among the dead. Many sailors spoke later of the strange silence that followed the explosions, only the slap of waves against floating debris and the distant hiss of metal cooling in seawater. Seaman First Class Haruo Yoshino, treading water in a life jacket stained with fuel oil, later recalled the surreal experience of floating past recognizable pieces of his ship. A section of flight deck drifted nearby with its yellow guidelines still visible. A plane director's platform bobbed empty except for a pair of abandoned binoculars. These familiar objects, now transformed into maritime grave markers, hammered home the totality of the disaster. The rescue operations continued through the night, as Japanese destroyers methodically searched grid patterns for survivors. Searchlight beams revealed scenes of almost biblical devastation. Men blackened with oil and smoke, their uniforms burned away and their faces masks of shock and exhaustion. Some had been in the water for hours, kept alive only by life preservers and the desperate will to survive. Hospital spaces aboard the rescue destroyers quickly overflowed with casualties. Corpsmen worked by the light of battle lanterns, treating burns with whatever medical supplies they could commandeer from ship's stores. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the lingering odor of aviation gasoline that clung to every survivor, creating an olfactory signature that would trigger nightmares for decades to come. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, pulled from the water after floating for 6 hours, remembered the strange relief of feeling solid deck plates beneath his feet again. But that relief was immediately tempered by the realization that his entire world, the Kido Butai, that had seemed invincible just that morning, had ceased to exist. Radio operators aboard the rescue vessels tapped out casualty reports with mechanical precision, each transmission carrying names that would never again appear on duty rosters. The final accounting would take weeks, but initial estimates suggested that thousands of Japan's most experienced naval aviators and carrier crew members had died with their ships. The psychological impact on survivors proved as devastating as their physical wounds. These were men who had believed in Japanese naval superiority with religious fervor. They had participated in Pearl Harbor, raided Darwin, and driven British carriers from the Indian Ocean. Now they floated in life rafts, watching 4 fleet carriers burn like funeral pyres against a sky that suddenly seemed vast and hostile. As midnight approached, the last secondary explosions echoed across the Pacific. Ammunition magazines that had once supplied the aircraft that terrorized Pearl Harbor were now venting their contents uselessly into the night sky, creating brief fireworks displays that illuminated nothing but the scope of Japanese naval aviation's destruction. Can you imagine floating in that dark water, watching everything you believed about Japanese naval superiority literally going up in smoke while wondering if your own rescue ship might be the next target? The night was far from over, and Admiral Yamamoto's main body was still approaching from the west, carrying enough firepower to level Midway if he could bring himself to continue an operation that had already cost him the heart of his carrier force. Section 6. Yamamoto's Dilemma. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, staring at radio messages that transformed his master plan into a chronicle of disaster unfolding across hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean. The architect of Pearl Harbor faced a decision that would define his legacy and potentially determine Japan's fate in the Pacific War. His main body fleet, centered around the most powerful battleship ever built, was still steaming toward Midway with enough firepower to reduce the American garrison to rubble. But the Kido Butai, the fast carrier striking force that was supposed to clear the way for invasion, had just ceased to exist as an operational unit. The radio traffic from the battle zone painted a picture of catastrophe that challenged everything Yamamoto believed about naval warfare. 4 fleet carriers lost in a single day. Thousands of irreplaceable aircrew dead or missing. The elite formations that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months reduced to burning hulks drifting in oil-slicked seas. Commander Yasoji Watanabe, Yamamoto's senior staff officer, approached with another decoded message, his face reflecting the shock that permeated the flagship's command spaces. The taste of morning coffee had turned bitter in officers' mouths as each successive transmission confirmed that Operation MI had become the most devastating defeat in Japanese naval history. But Yamamoto was not a man who accepted defeat without examining every tactical option. His surface fleet still possessed overwhelming firepower advantage over any American force that could reach Midway. The battleships Yamato and Musashi alone carried 18-inch guns that could sink cruisers with single salvos. His heavy cruisers and destroyers outnumbered anything Admiral Nimitz could deploy in the Central Pacific. The problem was time and distance. His carriers had died while his main body was still hundreds of miles from the action, maintained at long range to preserve radio silence, and tactical surprise. Now that surprise was meaningless, and the distance that was supposed to protect his battleships from American air attack had become a liability that prevented him from influencing the battle's outcome. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Yamamoto's operations officer, spread charts across the wardroom table as staff officers debated their limited options. The smell of cigarette smoke, mixed with coffee, and the lingering odor of paint and metal that characterized warship interiors. Red pins marked American positions, while blue pins showed the scattered remnants of Japanese forces, a visual representation of how completely their battle plan had collapsed. The American carriers that had delivered this devastating blow were somewhere northeast of Midway, probably refueling and rearming for another strike. Intelligence suggested that Enterprise and Hornet remained operational, along with whatever aircraft could still fly from the damaged Yorktown. Against this force, Yamamoto could deploy only land-based bombers from Wake Island and the Marshall Islands aircraft with limited range and no carrier experience. More troubling was the broader strategic situation. Japanese intelligence had consistently underestimated American industrial capacity and pilot training programs. The carriers destroyed at Midway could be replaced, though it might take years. The experienced aircrew who went down with them could never be replaced. Every veteran pilot who died in the Pacific depths represented thousands of hours of training and combat experience that Japan's increasingly strained training establishment couldn't reproduce quickly enough. Lieutenant Commander Fuji, monitoring radio traffic from surviving ships, reported that destroyer rescue operations were continuing despite the risk of submarine attack. American submarines were known to be operating in the area, and damaged Japanese vessels made tempting targets for torpedo attacks. The irony was bitter ships that had survived carrier airstrikes might still fall victim to underwater predators. Yamamoto's strategic genius had always focused on decisive battles that would force America to negotiate rather than fight a prolonged war of attrition. Pearl Harbor was supposed to cripple American naval power for years. The Doolittle raid on Tokyo had demonstrated that America retained both the capability and will to strike the Japanese homeland. Midway was intended to draw out and destroy the remaining American carriers, completing the strategic paralysis that Pearl Harbor had begun. Instead, Operation MI had accomplished the exact opposite. American carrier aviation had not been destroyed. It had been revealed as a mature, dangerous force capable of coordinating complex attacks against experienced Japanese formations. The Kido Butai's aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated through 6 months of victories, had been shattered in a single morning. The Admiral's cabin fell silent except for the hum of ventilation fans and the distant throb of Yamato's massive engines. Outside the porthole, the Pacific stretched endlessly under afternoon sunlight, giving no hint of the drama playing out beneath its surface. Somewhere in that vast blue expanse, the most experienced carrier aviators in the world were floating in life rafts or sleeping their final sleep in aircraft graves 2 miles below the surface. Yamamoto faced a choice that would echo through military academies for decades. He could continue toward Midway, using his battleships and cruisers to bombard the American garrison into submission. The island might still be taken, giving Japan a foothold in the Central Pacific and a base for future operations. But what would be the point? Without carriers to provide air cover, any Japanese garrison on Midway would be vulnerable to American air attack from Hawaiian bases. Alternatively, he could order a general retreat, preserving his remaining surface forces for future battles, while accepting that Operation MI had failed completely. This option preserved ships and men but represented a strategic defeat that would shift the initiative to American forces throughout the Pacific. The decision carried implications far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized decisive battle as the path to victory. Yamamoto himself had argued that Japan could not win a prolonged war against American industrial capacity. If the Imperial Navy couldn't achieve decisive victory with its most powerful available force, what hope remained for favorable peace negotiations? Staff officers debated in hushed tones, while their commander stared at charts that no longer reflected reality. The carefully planned operation that was supposed to extend Japanese dominance across the Pacific had instead revealed the fundamental weakness of an empire stretched beyond its sustainable limits. At 8:30 p.m., Yamamoto made the decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Operation MI was terminated. All Japanese forces would withdraw immediately to avoid further losses. The most powerful naval striking force in Japanese history would return to home waters, having accomplished nothing except the destruction of its own carrier aviation. The order rippled through the combined fleet, with the finality of a death sentence. Battleship crews who had spent months preparing for the decisive surface engagement that would crown Japanese naval supremacy instead, found themselves turning away from battle. Their massive guns never fired in anger. The psychological impact proved almost as devastating as the material losses. Captain Kurashima drafted the withdrawal order in precise naval terminology that couldn't disguise its essential meaning. Japan had suffered its first major defeat of the Pacific War. The Kido Butai that had struck Pearl Harbor, terrorized the Indian Ocean, and dominated Pacific sea lanes for 6 months had been reduced to scattered survivors floating in life rafts. What made the defeat particularly bitter was its completeness. Japanese forces hadn't been defeated by superior numbers or advanced technology. They had been outfought by an enemy that had learned from earlier defeats and applied those lessons with devastating effectiveness. The Americans had cracked Japanese naval codes, positioned their forces perfectly, and executed coordinated attacks that exploited every weakness in Japanese tactical doctrine. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, had been shattered beyond repair. News of the defeat would eventually reach the Japanese public through carefully sanitized official communiques, but the strategic implications were immediately apparent to anyone who understood naval warfare. Japan had lost the initiative in the Pacific and would never regain it. Think about standing on that battleship bridge, watching your life's work, the perfect naval operation. You spent months planning dissolve into reports of burning carriers and casualty lists that read like the roster of your Naval Academy graduating class. As Yamato's massive bulk turned westward toward the setting sun, Admiral Yamamoto began composing the report that would end his career and mark the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific toward the inevitable final battle for the homeland itself. Section 7. The Reckoning. Petty Officer First Class. Juzo Mori floated in the dark Pacific, his life jacket keeping him barely afloat as burning aviation gasoline created an orange glow on the horizon where Hiryu had finally slipped beneath the waves. The human cost of Japan's first major defeat was written in the faces of survivors hauled aboard rescue destroyers throughout the night of June 4th and into the early morning of June 5th. These were the men who had believed themselves invincible veterans of Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and the Indian Ocean raids who now found themselves clinging to debris while their ships burned around them. Mori had been a plane handler aboard Soryu when the American dive bombers found their target. He remembered the whistling sound of bombs falling through air, followed by explosions that lifted steel deck plates like paper and turned familiar workspace into an inferno. The smell of burning aviation gasoline mixed with something else, something that took him hours to identify as the odor of his shipmates' flesh cooking in temperatures that melted aluminum fittings into shapeless puddles. The destroyer Tanikaze approached through oil-slicked seas, her searchlights cutting through smoke and steam that rose from the water where fuel continued burning. Rescue lines snaked down her sides as sailors worked to haul survivors aboard, their faces reflecting the shock of men who had witnessed the destruction of everything they believed about Japanese naval superiority. In Tanikaze's sickbay, ship's medical officer, Lieutenant Sato, worked by the light of battle lanterns to treat burns and trauma injuries that overwhelmed his limited supplies. The acrid smell of antiseptic mixed with the lingering odor of aviation fuel that clung to every survivor's clothing. Men who had been proud members of elite carrier air groups now lay on stretchers, their uniforms burned away and their confidence shattered along with their ships. Seaman Haruki Ito, pulled from the water after 6 hours clinging to a section of flight deck, later described the surreal experience of watching his world end in real time. I saw Kaga explode, not just catch fire, but explode like a volcano. The flight deck lifted up and broke in half. Aircraft that were supposed to attack the Americans instead flew apart in pieces, and men I had eaten breakfast with disappeared in smoke. The casualty reports that reached Admiral Yamamoto's staff painted a picture of institutional devastation that went far beyond simple ship losses. Each carrier had taken with it hundreds of experienced aircrew, maintenance specialists, and flight deck personnel who represented decades of accumulated expertise. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter pilots, had survived the battle but watched helplessly as younger pilots died in aircraft that malfunctioned due to rushed maintenance and inadequate training. What Japanese naval intelligence had failed to anticipate was the quality of American pilot training and aircraft performance. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers that destroyed 4 carriers in 5 minutes were flown by aviators who had learned from earlier defeats and adapted their tactics accordingly. American anti-aircraft gunnery had improved dramatically since Pearl Harbor, turning Japanese formations into shooting galleries rather than the precise surgical instruments they had been 6 months earlier. The deeper problem lay in Japan's industrial and training infrastructure. American shipyards were launching new aircraft carriers every few months, while Japanese yards struggled to complete vessels that had been under construction since before Pearl Harbor. American pilot training programs were producing hundreds of aviators monthly, while Japanese flight schools couldn't replace the experienced crews lost in a single battle. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, one of the few surviving squadron leaders from the morning's strikes, spent 3 days floating in a life raft before rescue. The experience gave him time to contemplate the tactical and strategic errors that had led to disaster. "We flew the same attacks we had practiced for months," he later wrote in his official report, "but the Americans had learned to counter everything we thought we knew about carrier warfare." The most bitter irony was that Japanese naval doctrine had created the conditions for its own destruction. The emphasis on massed, coordinated strikes meant that all 4 carriers had to maneuver together, making them perfect targets for the American dive bombers that found them. The rigid adherence to precise timing had prevented flexible responses when American torpedo attacks disrupted the planned launch sequence. Perhaps most devastating was the loss of institutional memory. The aircrew who died at Midway had participated in every major Japanese naval victory since Pearl Harbor. They understood carrier operations, navigation, weapons, employment, and tactical coordination at levels that couldn't be taught in flight schools. Their deaths represented the end of Japan's brief period of tactical naval aviation superiority. Survivors spoke frequently of the psychological impact of watching invincible ships die so quickly. Seaman Yoshino later recalled, "We had been told that American pilots were cowards who couldn't fight, but they kept coming through our fighters, through our anti-aircraft fire, diving straight down into our ships like they didn't care about dying. That's when I knew we were fighting a different kind of enemy than our officers had told us about." The rescue operations continued for 3 days, as Japanese destroyers methodically searched debris fields for survivors. Many of the men pulled from the water suffered from exposure, fuel oil poisoning, and psychological trauma that would haunt them for decades. Hospital ships dispatched from the Marshall Islands found their medical facilities overwhelmed by casualties who required treatment for everything from severe burns to complete nervous collapse. What emerged from survivor interviews was a picture of American tactical adaptation that Japanese intelligence had completely failed to anticipate. The coordinated dive bomber attacks that destroyed the Kido Butai weren't lucky accidents. They were the product of extensive training, improved aircraft, and tactical innovation that had learned from earlier defeats in battles like the Coral Sea. By June 7th, when the last survivors were recovered and the final casualty reports compiled, the scope of Japanese losses became clear. 4 fleet carriers sunk, over 3,000 experienced naval personnel dead or missing, hundreds of aircraft destroyed. Most critically, the irreplaceable human expertise that had made Japanese carrier aviation the most effective naval striking force in the world had been eliminated in a single battle. Can you imagine floating in that dark water, watching everything you believed about your country's military superiority, literally sinking beneath the waves while wondering if the war you thought you were winning had just been lost? But for one Japanese survivor, the Battle of Midway was just the beginning of a personal journey that would take him from the depths of the Pacific to an unexpected encounter with his American enemies decades later. Section 8. Echoes from the Deep. In 2023, 81 years after the battle, deep-sea exploration vessels captured the first clear images of Akagi and Kaga resting upright on the abyssal plain, their steel hulls transformed into silent monuments to the day Japanese naval supremacy died. The high-definition footage revealed bomb damage exactly where American dive bomber pilots had reported their hits, finally confirming details that historians had debated for decades. But for the few surviving veterans of the battle, these images carried emotional weight that transcended historical curiosity. They were looking at the graves of their shipmates and the tombstones of their empire's Pacific ambitions. Petty Officer Juzo Mori, now in his late 90s and one of the last living survivors of Soryu, watched the underwater footage from his apartment in Yokohama, with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I can still smell the aviation gasoline burning," he told visiting historians. "I can still hear my friends calling for help in the water. Some voices I will never forget." The psychological trauma that began in those oil-slicked seas had echoed through decades of Japanese veterans' lives. Many survivors never spoke publicly about their experiences at Midway, carrying the shame of defeat and the guilt of survival in cultures that venerated death before dishonor. Others found themselves reliving the battle in nightmares that persisted well into the 21st century. But Midway's legacy extended far beyond individual trauma. The battle marked the beginning of American industrial and tactical dominance that would define the remainder of the Pacific War. By 1943, American shipyards were launching fleet carriers faster than Japanese forces could sink them, while pilot training programs produced aviators by the thousands. The strategic miscalculations that led to disaster at Midway revealed fundamental flaws in Japanese military planning that extended beyond naval operations. The assumption that American forces would fight defensive battles rather than seek decisive engagements proved catastrophically wrong. The belief that American pilots lacked fighting spirit was shattered by suicide attacks against heavily defended carrier formations. Most critically, Japanese leaders failed to understand that they were fighting an industrial war against an enemy capable of replacing losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The Kido Butai's destruction at Midway eliminated Japan's ability to conduct offensive carrier operations, just as American shipbuilding was reaching peak production levels. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, who spent decades analyzing the battle's tactical lessons, eventually concluded that Japanese defeat was inevitable, regardless of individual decisions or mechanical failures. "We were fighting the last battle of the previous war," he wrote in his memoirs. "The Americans were fighting the first battle of a new kind of warfare that we didn't understand." The human stories that emerged from Midway's aftermath revealed both the brutality of naval warfare and the resilience of individual survivors. Seaman Haruki Ito, who had watched Kaga explode beneath his feet, eventually became a merchant marine officer and spent 40 years crossing the same Pacific waters where his friends had died. "Every time I sailed past Midway," he recalled, "I would stop whatever I was doing and observe a minute of silence." Perhaps the most poignant legacy of the battle came from an unexpected source. In 1992, 50 years after Midway, several American and Japanese veterans met at Pearl Harbor for a commemoration ceremony that brought former enemies together in recognition of shared sacrifice. Former dive bomber pilot Richard Best shook hands with Juzo Mori, the Soryu survivor, in a moment that symbolized the transformation of bitter enemies into allies. "We were all young men doing our duty," Best told the assembled crowd. "The war made us enemies, but surviving it made us understand that we had more in common than we had differences." Mori, speaking through a translator, agreed. "We fought for our countries. Now we can mourn our dead together." The tactical lessons of Midway influenced naval doctrine for generations. The importance of intelligence, the vulnerability of surface ships to air attack, and the decisive nature of carrier aviation became fundamental principles that shaped Cold War naval strategy and continue to influence modern military planning. But for the men who survived those burning flight decks and oil-slicked seas, Midway remained intensely personal. The battle had taken their friends, destroyed their ships, and ended their belief in Japanese invincibility. Some found meaning in that sacrifice by dedicating their lives to ensuring that such devastation would never be repeated. The deep-sea images of sunken carriers that emerged in 2023 provided a final, haunting coda to stories that began with young sailors eating rice balls in carrier mess halls and ended with old men watching underwater footage of their youth's grave sites. The steel hulls resting on the Pacific floor had become time capsules, preserving moments of catastrophic defeat that changed the course of world history. Those ships still rest there today, silent witnesses to 5 minutes that decided the fate of empires and the lives of millions across the Pacific. In their flooded hangars and twisted flight decks lie the remains of aircraft that should have bombed American cities and the personal effects of sailors who believed they were fighting for a cause that could not fail. The Battle of Midway from the Japanese perspective reveals a truth that military historians have recognized for centuries. Wars are won and lost not just by superior strategy or technology, but by the ability to adapt, learn, and overcome the psychological trauma of devastating defeat. The young sailors who watched their carriers burn learned that lesson in the most brutal way possible. Can you imagine carrying that knowledge for 80 years, understanding that you witnessed the exact moment when your country's hopes for Pacific dominance died in 5 minutes of perfectly executed American dive bombing attacks? Today, as those final veterans pass into history, their voices join the eternal silence of the deep Pacific, where 4 aircraft carriers rest as monuments to the day that changed everything and the men who lived to tell the story.